I never thought a phone call at 3 in the morning would change my life forever. The voice on the other end belonged to my grandmother's lawyer, delivering news that hit me like a freight train. Grandma Rose had passed away in her sleep, and she'd left me her entire 2,000-acre ranch in Montana. Standing in my cramped Chicago apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills and empty pizza boxes, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The Sunset Ridge Ranch, the place where I'd spent every summer as a kid, learning to ride horses and fix fences, was now mine. "There's just one condition," the lawyer continued. "You have to live on the property for at least 1 year to claim full ownership." My heart raced. After losing my job at the construction company and facing eviction, this felt like divine intervention. Grandma Rose had always been my anchor, the one person who believed in me when everyone else had given up. I'd been working dead-end jobs since my divorce, barely scraping by. My ex-wife had taken everything in the settlement, including my confidence. But this ranch represented hope, a chance to start over, to build something meaningful with my own hands. The next morning, I called my boss and quit. I packed everything I owned into my beat-up Ford pickup and started driving west. As the Chicago skyline disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. The drive took 2 days, but every mile brought me closer to redemption. I was going home to claim my inheritance and rebuild my life on the land that had shaped me as a boy. The ranch looked exactly as I remembered, yet somehow smaller than my childhood memories had painted it. Rolling hills stretched endlessly under the Montana sky, dotted with cattle that grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. The main house, a sprawling 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, stood proudly against the backdrop of distant mountains. I parked my truck and walked slowly toward the front door, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. Every step brought back memories of Grandma Rose teaching me to milk cows, showing me how to read the weather in the clouds, and telling me stories about my grandfather who'd built this place with his bare hands. The key was exactly where she'd always kept it, under the third loose board on the porch steps. Some things never changed. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and old wood, just like it always had. Family photos lined the mantel, including several of me as a gap-toothed kid holding fishing poles and baby calves. I found a note on the kitchen table, written in Grandma's shaky handwriting. "Jake, this land has been in our family for 4 generations. I know you'll take care of it like it's taken care of us. Love always, Grandma Rose." Tears stung my eyes as I read those words. She'd believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a responsibility, a legacy that I was determined to honor. That first night, I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. For the first time in years, I felt peace settling into my bones. 3 weeks into my new life, I was repairing a section of fence when I saw a black SUV kicking up dust on the main road. It turned into my driveway, and my stomach dropped when I recognized the passenger, my mother, Linda, whom I hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. She stepped out of the vehicle, followed by a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, wearing an expensive suit that looked completely out of place on a working ranch. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his smile reminded me of a used car salesman. "Hello, Jake," Mom said, her voice strained. "This is my husband, Richard Blackwood. We got married 6 months ago." Richard extended his hand with that practiced smile. "Pleasure to meet you, son. I've heard so much about you." I didn't take his hand. Something about him set my teeth on edge, and the way he called me son made my skin crawl. "What brings you out here, Mom?" "We need to talk," she said, avoiding my eyes. "About the ranch." Richard pulled a manila folder from his briefcase. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about your grandmother's will. You see, Rose borrowed a significant amount of money from me before she passed away. She used the ranch as collateral." My blood ran cold. "That's impossible. Grandma would never risk losing this place." "I'm afraid she did. Richard said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The debt hasn't been paid, which means the ranch now belongs to me. I have all the legal documentation right here." I stared at the papers he thrust toward me, my world crashing down around me for the second time in a month. My hands shook as I examined the papers Richard had spread across Grandma's kitchen table. Everything looked official: loan agreements, promissory notes, and a deed transfer document that made my stomach turn. According to these papers, Grandma Rose had borrowed $500,000 from Richard Blackwood 2 years ago, using the ranch as collateral. "This doesn't make sense," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma never mentioned any financial troubles. The ranch was profitable." Richard leaned back in his chair with that infuriating smile. "Your grandmother was a proud woman, Jake. She probably didn't want to burden you with her problems. The cattle market took a hit, and she needed cash to keep the operation running." Mom finally spoke up, though she still wouldn't meet my eyes. "Richard tried to work with her, gave her extensions on the payments, but when she passed away, the debt became due immediately," Richard finished. "It's all spelled out in the contract. I'm sorry, but business is business." I studied the signatures on the documents. They looked like Grandma's handwriting, but something felt wrong. The woman who'd taught me to never borrow money I couldn't pay back wouldn't have risked everything on a loan. "I need time to process this," I said, standing up from the table, "and I want to have these documents reviewed by a lawyer." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, take all the time you need. But I should mention that I've already filed the necessary paperwork with the county. The transfer will be official within 30 days. After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the papers and feeling like my world was collapsing again. I drove into town the next morning and found the best lawyer I could afford, Sarah Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in property disputes. Her office was small but organized, with law books lining every wall and a coffee maker that looked like it had seen better days. "These documents look legitimate on the surface," she said, after reviewing everything for an hour. "But something bothers me about the timeline. Your grandmother was known for being financially conservative. It's unusual for someone like her to take on this level of debt." "That's what I thought too," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "Is there any way to challenge this?" Sarah tapped her pen against her desk. "We can investigate, but it'll take time and money. I'll need to examine your grandmother's financial records, interview people who knew her, and possibly hire a handwriting expert to verify these signatures." "How much time?" "Several months, maybe longer. And there's no guarantee we'll find anything that would invalidate the loan." I felt my hope deflating. "What about the 30-day deadline Richard mentioned?" "That's real. If we can't find grounds to challenge the documents before then, you'll lose the ranch." She leaned back in her chair. "I have to ask, do you have the money to pay off the debt?" I almost laughed. "I barely had enough money to drive out here from Chicago." "Then we better get started immediately. I'll need a retainer of $5,000. I stared at her, knowing I didn't have anywhere close to that amount. My inheritance was slipping away and I was powerless to stop it. I sold everything I could, my truck, my tools, even my grandfather's watch, to scrape together Sarah's retainer. For the next 2 weeks, we worked around the clock investigating Richard Blackwood and the suspicious loan documents. What we discovered made my blood boil. Richard had a history of targeting elderly property owners, offering them loans with impossible terms, then swooping in to claim their land when they couldn't pay. He'd done it at least 6 times in the past decade, always staying just within the bounds of legality. "He's a vulture," Sarah said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "But unfortunately, being morally bankrupt isn't illegal." We interviewed Grandma's banker, her accountant, and several neighbors. Everyone told the same story. Rose had been financially stable right up until her death. Her cattle operation was profitable, and she'd never mentioned needing money. "Mrs. Rose was sharp as a tack," said Tom Henderson, who owned the neighboring ranch. She came over for coffee just a week before she passed, talking about improvements she wanted to make to the property. She was excited about leaving it to you. But despite all our investigating, we couldn't find the smoking gun we needed. The documents appeared genuine, and Richard had covered his tracks well. With only a week left before the transfer deadline, I was running out of options and hope. Sarah tried to stay positive, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. "We'll keep fighting until the last minute," she promised. "Sometimes miracles happen." I wanted to believe her, but miracles seemed to be in short supply. 3 days before the deadline, I was going through Grandma's personal effects in her bedroom, looking for anything that might help our case. I'd been putting off this painful task, but desperation drove me to search every corner of the house. In her old cedar chest, beneath quilts and photo albums, I found a small leather journal I'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and the pages were filled with Grandma's careful handwriting. Most entries were mundane, notes about cattle prices, weather observations, and reminders about ranch maintenance. But as I flipped through the pages, one entry from 18 months ago caught my attention. "That Blackwood man came by again today, pressuring me to sell the south pasture. I told him the same thing I've told him before. This land isn't for sale at any price. He got angry and said I'd regret my decision. There's something cold about his eyes that makes me uneasy." My heart started racing as I read more entries. Grandma had documented several visits from Richard, each one more aggressive than the last. She'd written about feeling threatened and had even considered calling the sheriff. The final entry about Richard was dated just 2 months before her death. Blackwood showed up with some papers, claiming I owed him money. I've never borrowed a dime from that man. He said he'd be back with proof of the debt. I'm going to call Jake and warn him about this snake. But she'd never called me. She'd died peacefully in her sleep just a week later. I grabbed the journal and raced to town, my hands shaking as I drove. This was the evidence we needed to prove Richard was a fraud. Sarah's eyes widened as she read Grandma's journal entries. "This changes everything," she said, reaching for her phone. "If your grandmother documented that she never borrowed money from Blackwood and that he was pressuring her to sell, we have grounds to challenge the entire loan." "But will it be enough?" I asked, pacing around her office like a caged animal. "Combined with what we've already discovered about his pattern of targeting elderly landowners, yes. This journal establishes that your grandmother was of sound mind and specifically denied owing him money." Sarah immediately filed an emergency injunction to stop the property transfer, citing fraud and elder abuse. The judge agreed to hear our case the next day, just 24 hours before Richard's deadline. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on Grandma's porch, holding her journal and feeling her presence in the cool mountain air. She'd tried to protect the ranch even from beyond the grave, leaving me the evidence I needed to fight back. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. Richard arrived with 2 expensive lawyers, looking confident and smug. Mom sat beside him, still refusing to make eye contact with me. I wondered how she could support a man who was trying to steal her own mother's legacy. When Sarah presented Grandma's journal to the court, I watched Richard's face change. The color drained from his cheeks, and his confident smile disappeared. His lawyers huddled together, whispering frantically. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "this journal proves that Mrs. Rose Henderson never acknowledged owing Mr. Blackwood any money. In fact, she specifically documented his attempts to pressure her into selling her property." The tide was finally turning in our favor. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Walsh, examined Grandma's journal carefully. She read several entries aloud, and with each word, Richard seemed to shrink in his chair. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Walsh said, her voice sharp as a blade, "can you explain why Mrs. Henderson would document that she never borrowed money from you, if indeed she had signed these loan documents?" Richard's lead attorney stood up. "Your Honor, elderly people sometimes become confused about their financial affairs. Mrs. Henderson may have forgotten about the loan." "Forgotten?" The judge's eyebrows shot up. According to this journal, she was documenting his visits and her concerns about his behavior right up until her death. That doesn't sound like confusion to me. Sarah then presented our evidence about Richard's pattern of targeting elderly landowners. The judge listened intently as we detailed his history of suspicious loans and property acquisitions. Furthermore, Your Honor, Sarah continued, we've discovered that Mr. Blackwood married the defendant's mother just 6 months ago, shortly after Mrs. Henderson's death. This appears to be part of a calculated plan to legitimize his claim to the property. I glanced at Mom, who was now staring at her hands in her lap. I wondered if she was finally realizing that she'd been used as a pawn in Richard's scheme. The judge called for a recess to review all the evidence. During the break, I saw Richard arguing heatedly with his lawyers in the hallway. His calm facade was cracking, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope blooming in my chest. When court reconvened, Judge Walsh had made her decision. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Walsh began, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. I find that the loan documents in question are fraudulent. The journal entries clearly establish that Mrs. Henderson never acknowledged any debt to Mr. Blackwood, and his pattern of targeting elderly property owners suggests a deliberate scheme to defraud vulnerable individuals. Richard shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Those documents are completely legitimate. Sit down, Mr. Blackwood, the judge ordered sharply. I'm not finished. She turned her attention to the packed courtroom. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into Mr. Blackwood's business practices. The evidence suggests he may have committed similar fraud against other elderly property owners. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Sarah squeezed my arm, her face beaming with victory. The injunction against the property transfer is hereby made permanent, Judge Walsh continued. Mr. Henderson retains full ownership of the Sunset Ridge Ranch, as specified in his grandmother's legitimate will. The courtroom erupted in whispers and movement. Richard's lawyers were already packing their briefcases, distancing themselves from their client. I watched as 2 sheriff's deputies approached Richard, and I realized the judge had ordered his immediate arrest. Richard Blackwood, one deputy said, you're under arrest for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit theft. As they led him away in handcuffs, he turned to glare at me with pure hatred in his eyes. This isn't over, he snarled. But I knew it was. Grandma Rose had won her final battle, and the ranch was safe. After the courtroom cleared, I found Mom sitting alone on a bench outside, crying quietly into her hands. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. She'd chosen Richard over family, but seeing her broken and alone stirred something in me that I thought had died. Mom, I said softly, sitting down beside her. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. I'm so sorry, Jake. I had no idea what kind of man he was. He seemed so charming, so caring. After your father died, I was lonely, and Richard made me feel special again. How long did you know about his plan for the ranch? She shook her head. I didn't know until we came to see you. He told me we were just going to visit, to meet my son and see the property. When he pulled out those papers, she wiped her eyes with a tissue. I should have stood up for you for Mom's memory. I was a coward. I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the hurt and betrayal. But looking at her now, I saw a woman who'd been manipulated and used, just like Grandma had been. He's good at what he does, Mom. That's how con artists work. They find people's vulnerabilities and exploit them. Can you ever forgive me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I thought about Grandma Rose and what she would have wanted. She'd always believed in second chances, in the power of family to heal old wounds. We'll work on it, I said, putting my arm around her shoulders. But it's going to take time. For the first time in years, my mother leaned against me, and I felt the first crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. 6 months later, the ranch was thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible. The investigation into Richard's activities had uncovered a massive fraud scheme spanning multiple states. He was facing federal charges and would likely spend the next decade in prison. More importantly, several of his victims had been able to reclaim their stolen properties, including an elderly couple in Wyoming who'd lost their family farm to one of Richard's fake loans. Mom had moved into the guest house on the ranch, and slowly, carefully, we were rebuilding our relationship. She threw herself into helping with the ranch work, and I discovered she had a natural talent for managing the business side of the operation. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said one evening as we watched the sunset from the porch. "You've turned this place into something special." I'd expanded the cattle operation and started offering horseback riding lessons to tourists. The extra income allowed me to hire 2 full-time ranch hands and invest in improvements to the property. But the best part was the sense of purpose I'd found. Every morning I woke up knowing I was carrying on a family legacy, honoring the memory of the woman who'd saved my life even after her death. Sarah Martinez had become a good friend, and she'd helped me establish a foundation to assist elderly people who'd been targeted by financial predators. We called it the Rose Henderson Foundation, and it had already helped dozens of families fight back against scammers and fraudsters. The ranch that had once seemed like an impossible dream was now my reality, and I was determined to protect it for future generations. 1 year after that life-changing phone call, I stood in the same spot where I'd first seen Richard's black SUV approaching. But this time, the vehicle pulling into my driveway was a school bus filled with local kids on a field trip. I'd started an educational program to teach children about ranch life, sustainable farming, and the importance of preserving family traditions. Watching their faces light up as they petted the calves and learned to ride horses reminded me of my own childhood summers with Grandma Rose. "Mr. Henderson," one little girl asked, "how did you know you wanted to be a rancher?" I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. "Sometimes life has a way of showing you where you belong," I told her. "You just have to be brave enough to follow the path, even when it's scary." That evening, after the kids had gone home and the ranch had settled into its peaceful rhythm, I sat on the porch with Grandma's journal in my hands. I'd started adding my own entries, documenting the daily life of the ranch and the lessons I was learning about family, forgiveness, and the power of never giving up. As the stars appeared in the Montana sky, I felt Grandma Rose's presence in the gentle breeze that rustled through the cottonwood trees. She'd given me more than just land. She'd given me a second chance at life, a purpose worth fighting for, and the strength to protect what matters most. The ranch would continue to thrive, passing from generation to generation, just as she'd always intended. And somewhere in the peaceful silence of the countryside, I knew she was smiling.